And I think that it's fair to say that, following on from my previous programme, that it's now clear that there's been a sudden shift in mood on the part of Western coverage of the war, as it's becoming increasingly clear that Mariupol is very close to falling. There's been a great deal of discussion about all sorts of war crimes, real, perhaps, alleged, perhaps, and interestingly, they've come from both sides. The Russians continue to claim that the Ukrainian fighters in Mariupol are using the residents of the city as human shields and have been obstructing their evacuation. The Western powers and Ukraine are accusing Russia of abducting tens of thousands of residents of Mariupol and taking them to Russia against their will. And they're also making claims that the Russians are attacking things like care homes and are engaging in all kinds of actions. I'm not going to discuss in any detail any of these allegations. I have no conceivable way, one way or the other, of establishing their truth. So I'm not going to discuss them. You'll find plenty of commentaries about them in all sorts of places. As I've said before, it's not unusual for fighting to take place in cities, and that inevitably means that residents, civilians, become caught up in the fighting, and that may explain some of the human shield allegations. And also, by the way, I'm not sure why it is a case of abduction to talk about people being evacuated to Russia. I suspect that we're looking at the kind of information wars that take place during conflicts, and I'm not going to explore them any more deeply than that. However, it is now, I think, indisputable that the fighting in Mariupol is now approaching its end. There's fighting going on apparently all over the city. There are small groups of Ukrainian fighters in various parts of the center of the city who've been trying to resist. And there's information that a Russian media group, a group of Russian journalists themselves came under fire in what, even whilst they were in what they believed to be a secure area, showing that there are in fact as yet no secure, fully secure areas for the Russians in Mariupol. But at the same time, it seems indisputable that these groups of fighters are being cleared steadily, and that the main force is now increasingly, a main group force of Ukrainian fighters is increasingly concentrated in the industrial facilities, the big factories like the giant Azovstal steelworks, which are presumably located in the outskirts, the southern outskirts of the city. And over the last couple of hours, there's been reports that the Russian Black Sea Fleet has also participated increasingly in the fighting, and that they've been shelling these Ukrainian troops in these industrial facilities. I don't know which ships, and I don't know whether that's conventional artillery or missiles, probably both actually. But anyway, the situation for the Ukrainians is clearly becoming increasingly critical. And incidentally, it's a sign of the intensity of the fighting in Mariupol that the Russians have confirmed that a senior Russian commander, a commander of what the Russians call naval infantry, in other words, a Marine general, a senior Marine general, has been killed in the fighting. There have been various reports at various times from Ukrainians about various Russian generals and senior military people who've been killed. The Russians have never commented on these claims. They've neither admitted them nor denied them. And until we get any confirmation from the Russians, I've treated all of those claims with great skepticism. But in this case, the Russians themselves almost immediately announced this person's death. And I would repeat again a point which I have made in previous programs, that his death should not be taken as any indication that the Russian military offensive in Mariupol is running into problems. Rather, it is the pattern of the Russian military conduct, that the commanders are there at the head of their troops, leading them into battle, not doing what you increasingly find in Western armies and what the United States repeatedly does, which is keep its senior commanders in the rear, where they are supposed to supervise the battle through from their headquarters, getting information from drones and other means of information. This is a pattern, by the way, of Russian conduct, military conduct, that goes all the way back to the Napoleonic Wars, and it's something that Russian soldiers expect their officers to do. And it doesn't, as I said, slow down the Russian military in any way. I remember how during the 2008 Georgia War, the Russian commander of the overall forces in that war got injured, but it didn't in fact slow down the Russian offensive against the Georgians, because the Russian military system is geared to accept casualties amongst its senior commanders. There's staff systems in place to ensure that whoever is wounded, an immediate replacement is there to take over, and that the battle plans are well distributed amongst the officers, the replacement officers, so that they can take over fast and quickly. So this death of this particular officer should be seen rather as an indication of how intense the fighting is. It doesn't in any way speak to the outcome of the fighting. And what perhaps speaks much more about the outcome of the fighting is that last night, and I'm talking about Sunday night, the Russian Defense Ministry issued a demand that the Ukrainian troops in Mariupol lay down their arms, and they were told that if they did so, they would be allowed to retreat from Mariupol. They were given a 2-hour window this morning, Monday, in order to retreat from Mariupol, allowing the Russians to take over what is left of the city. Now, shortly after, the Ukrainians rejected this offer. And I get to now make a general observation. I am at something of a loss to understand that Ukrainian decision, because it's clear that these Ukrainian soldiers who are now trapped in Mariupol have nowhere to retreat to, and that they are facing overwhelming firepower from the Russian military, including, it seems now, the Black Sea Fleet. So rejecting an offer to have them withdrawn from Mariupol, it seems to me all that it's going to do is to cause more people in Mariupol to die and more damage and destruction to be done. And since the outcome in Mariupol is not in doubt, I'm at something of a loss to understand the logic of this, either in humanitarian or military terms. It seems to me, if one is looking at this in military terms, that the primary responsibility of any commander is to look after his soldiers, and given that there is no logic, as far as I can see, no military logic in engaging in a hopeless stand, withdrawing those forces back to Ukrainian lines where they can be presumably refreshed and saved, and perhaps, to say it straightforwardly, thrown back into the battle somewhere else. That seems to me to make more logical sense. And of course, from a humanitarian point of view, prolonging a hopeless fight is only going to cause more people to die, and I don't really see the logic of that at all. And of course, it's something which, perhaps as the ultimate civilian that I am, it disturbs and upsets me. I don't, as I said, understand these decisions. Perhaps there is some military logic to them. Perhaps the Ukrainians need to keep Mariupol fighting so that they can either extract their forces from the rest of the Donbass or try to resupply them there by tying down Russian troops in Mariupol. Perhaps that's the logic of this. But I do worry that perhaps the true reason is more political. The need to create a legend of a heroic defense in Mariupol, perhaps to spread more stories of Russian war crimes, in Mariupol, perhaps to impress Western leaders who are going to hold a series of meetings over the course of this week. The G7 is meeting this week, as is the European Council and NATO, and President Biden of the United States is also coming to Europe, and he's also going to hold a meeting this week with the Polish leadership. He's going to visit Poland. So maybe these are the reasons why these people are being this fighting in Mariupol is being kept going. I would say that if there are military reasons to keep this fight going in Mariupol, well, there might be some military logic in that, but that still disturbs me. If it's all done for some political purpose, in order to keep the Western powers engaged and to try to gain publicity from this battle, then all I can say is that would, for me, be completely wrong and inhumane, and it would serve no practical or logical purpose that I can see. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that. What is also happening is that elsewhere in the fighting, it's becoming increasingly clear that in the Donbass, the Ukrainian position continues to crumble. And this is what I'm now going to come to in a moment. There's been very little commentary about the situation in the Donbass, in the military situation in the Donbass, in the Western media. But it's become increasingly clear that the mood in the media in the West is now starting to change. And in particular, there was a very interesting, very long article in the Financial Times of what I would call a news management nature, which I'm going to discuss briefly in this program. Like all Financial Times articles, it is behind a paywall. And I would say that the title seems to me to be somewhat misleading. It says, military briefing, Russian losses mask Ukraine's vulnerabilities. That's not perhaps a particularly interesting, eye-catching title, though it does accept that Ukraine does have military vulnerabilities. And then there is a long historic passage comparing the conduct of this war with the Winter War, the war that the Soviet Union fought against Finland in 1939. Now, I should say that I know a little bit about the Winter War, the war between the Soviets and the Finns in 1939, and I think that the analogy is actually a completely wrong one. I think it's a very bad one. It's based not on what actually happened in that war or the diplomacy that preceded it, more on Western accounts that circulated at the time about that war and which had become embedded very much in the Western narrative of that war and which have never been challenged in any sustained way outside academic literature. So I'm going to disregard all that part of the article which focuses on the Winter War and makes what, as I said, I think are completely misconceived or mistaken comparisons about it. But if you drill further into this article, you start to find concerns about the Ukrainian position. And you read, for example, that Thierry Burkhardt, France's chief of the defense staff, warned in an interview in Le Monde that Russia's forces may yet steamroller Ukrainian resistance. I, by the way, dislike intensely this resurrection of the old Russian steamroller trope to talk about the Russian military. Again, like many of these tropes that one sees in the West, it has very little value to it. But then we learned that Thierry Burkhardt said we learned that from the Financial Times that though Kiev says it has lost 1,300 troops compared with an estimated 7,000 killed, wounded or imprisoned for Russia, according to what US estimates. By the way, estimates which I consider completely unreliable. It then goes on to say that Western officials and analysts said the Ukrainian losses were probably far higher. Most agreed that an equivalent loss rate to Russia was plausible, equating to about 10% of Ukraine's troops. Now, I'm not going to get into the habit of comparing Ukrainian losses with Russian losses. For the record, I'm sure Ukrainian losses are heavier than Russian losses, but I'm not going to go there. The point is, the Financial Times says that Western analysts think that the Ukrainians might have suffered a loss rate of about 10% of their troops. But then the article goes on to say hundreds of Ukrainian tanks and vehicles have also been destroyed, according to one NATO official. The Russians, by the way, put the number of Ukrainian tanks and armoured vehicles which have been destroyed much higher, at something like, into the thousands. And a Russian commentator called Boris Rozhin has said that something like 400 of Ukraine's tanks, I think it was 350 of Ukraine's tanks, have been destroyed out of a possible total of 2,000. Those are his figures. But anyway, the Financial Times gives the admission that hundreds of Ukrainian tanks and vehicles have also been destroyed. And he goes on to say, he's quoted in the Financial Times, this is a NATO official, "I can tell you that Western arms supplies to Ukraine are absolutely critical at this point. Without them, I think we'd be in a very different place, notwithstanding the incredible heroism from the Ukrainians." And then he goes on to say, even the level of supply may be insufficient. Senior Ukrainian officials have told me that supplies of anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons have slowed to a trickle and stocks are running low, says Paul Grod, head of the Ukrainian World Congress. This needs to be addressed as soon as possible. Otherwise, Ukrainian fighters will be confronting Russian tanks with just machine guns. And there's talks from the Financial Times about how recent airstrikes have hit the Antonov aircraft works and Artem arms factory near Kiev and an aircraft repair plant near Lviv, indicating that Russia intends to cripple Ukraine's munitions manufacturing capacity. By the way, that is completely true. That has been very much the priority of the Russian air campaign. I would say that if you follow, again, Russian commentaries, most of the discussions have been about attacks on ammunition depots, fuel supply depots, and production facilities and repair shops, all intended to starve Ukrainian troops of the supplies and spare parts that they need in order to keep fighting. And by the way, the same, as I remember, was true in the Syrian conflict. The Russian forces, air forces in Syria and clearly in Ukraine itself, are not so much focused on attacking Syrian and radical fighters in Syria, Ukrainian ground forces, Ukrainian troops. What they are seeking to do, and it's apparently entirely consistent with Russian military practice, is that they're seeking to starve them of supplies of new weapons, of fuel, of ammunition, of those sort of things, so that the point eventually comes where they're not able to keep fighting. And then the Financial Times, we're coming back to the Financial Times. It says Ukraine's information dominance has masked its losses. Thousands of open source images of exploded Russian armor, I'm sure it's thousands, but anyway, have been taken by Ukrainian civilians who are unlikely to post similar pictures of their own side's losses. This has led to a natural bias in the online content being scrutinized by many analysts. And Russian troops, meanwhile, have their own mobile phones confiscated by commanders. A lesson from its covert invasion of Crimea in 2014 and intended to give Russia greater control over information. Instead, it left a vacuum that was filled by Ukrainian content. It's an interesting admission, by the way, that the information analysts have been working from in the West is almost exclusively Ukrainian, and that it may also be biased, and that may create biases. But anyway, the article then goes on to say that the Kremlin has nevertheless repeatedly insisted its operations are going to plan. And then we have one Western defense official saying, I have seen no evidence that its overall intent, that Russia's overall intent has changed. And then it goes on to admit, the Financial Times goes on to admit that one brigade of Ukrainian Marines, the 36th Naval Infantry Brigade, is trapped defending the besieged city of Mariupol. Notice that the Financial Times, as is so often the case with the Western militia, Western media makes no reference to the various radical formations of the Ukrainian armed forces, many of which, by the way, are indeed concentrated in Mariupol. It gives the impression that only one particular brigade is trapped in Mariupol from the Ukrainian army, a Marine brigade, and it doesn't mention the fact that there are these other forces, Ukrainian forces, that are also trapped there. But then it says, the article then goes on to say that Russian forces in the east and north, where logistical problems have been most acute because supplies come from depots in Belarus via narrow, vulnerable roads, not rail, that they've suffered logistical problems, but that this problem is now being addressed by the Russians by increased use of drones in the past week. Dozens are flying over Ukraine and being used to hit targets and to provide intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities to Russian battle groups. And there is no sign, this is from the Financial Times, that Russia is scaling back its plans despite supply problems. And then there's a quotation from a person, Kusti Salm, who is the permanent secretary at Estonia's defense ministry, that the Russians have not determined that they need to move to a defensive position, which is the first thing they would do if they're truly worried about supplies. Until that happens, the Russian meat grinder will keep grinding. That's a rather interesting choice of words, by the way. And then we have a comment from a person called Gustav Gressel, an analyst of Russia's military at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And he says by mid-April, we could see the resumption of large-scale Russian military operations. Of course, Putin has to think carefully about domestic opinion, but in theory, this is a force of 100,000 or so he can draw on in terms of reinforcements. And then we come to what I find is the most interesting section of the entire Financial Times article, which then goes on to say, perhaps Ukraine's biggest tactical vulnerability is its Joint Forces Operation, JFO, where the bulk of Ukraine's military assets are deployed just west of Donetsk and Lugansk. Russia was seeking to encircle Ukraine's troops, Western officials said, cutting them off from Kiev and drawing them into open combined arms combat, which plays to Russia's battle group's superiority. Crushing Ukraine's forces in such a way would be as much of a victory as capturing Kiev, some analysts said, invoking Karl von Clausewitz, the military theorist who saw the destruction of armies rather than the capture of cities as the fastest route to victory. Well, if you've been following the programs on this channel, and you've been following the programs that Alex Christoforou and I make on the DURAN, you will know that we have repeatedly said that it is in fact the Ukrainian army group in eastern Ukraine, the so-called Joint Forces Operation, which is the primary target of the Russian military, and that the focus of the Russian military, based on the precepts of Clausewitz, is the destruction of this army group, which is, according to the Financial Times, where the bulk of Ukraine's military assets are deployed, just west of Donetsk and Lugansk. So this article in the Financial Times, a very long article, looks to me to be preparing the readership of the Financial Times for the likely outcome of this battle in eastern Ukraine, the encirclement of and destruction of the greater part, the best part of the Ukrainian army, which is gradually emerging and which will accelerate once the Russians have completed their capture of the important port city of Mariupol. So it's a very interesting article, and of course we've now seen admissions appearing in the London Times, the Daily Telegraph, and now this longest, most detailed discussion of all in the Financial Times of what the real Russian strategy in Ukraine is, about where the real focus of the fighting is, about the fact that the Russians are conducting what an Estonian military official referred to as a meat grinder strategy, a horrible use of words, by the way, which I absolutely loathe and I will avoid using from now on. But anyway, a strategy to destroy the Ukrainian military in combat in eastern Ukraine and to achieve victory in that sort of way. And notice again the timeline. There's been a suggestion that the situation will become critical from about mid-April. And I would remind you, our viewers, or people who are watching this program and people who follow us on the DURAN, that Gonzalo Lira, who is our friend and acquaintance and who's reporting on this war from Ukraine itself, he also suggested that April is likely to be the final month of decision. He expected the war in Ukraine to be substantially over by the end of May. And this article in the Financial Times seems to correspond with this fairly closely. Incidentally, on the issue of supply, the Russian commentator, and I want to stress he is Russian, so, I'm not sure how well informed he is, though I get the impression that he is fairly well informed. I mean, Boris Rozhin, who I quoted earlier, he said that the most critical problem the Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine are facing is supplies of fuel, that the Russians are targeting their fuel supply, resupply situation, their fuel dumps and resupply stations. And Rozhin expects or believes that the fuel problems that are, according to him, already affecting the Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine and which are restricting their mobility will intensify in the second half of March, which is, of course, precisely where we now are. So I've gone into all of this in some detail because it seems to me that this gives us all some clarity about the military situation, and it's interesting to see that British readers are being gradually prepared with articles in the London Times, which I've discussed previously, the Daily Telegraph, and now this very long article in the Financial Times, that British readers, as the fall of Mariupol now looms ever closer, British readers are now being prepared for the prospect of a Ukrainian collapse in the coming weeks. Now, given that there is a prospect of a Ukrainian collapse, I come back to a point that I've made in multiple programs on this channel and on the DURAN, which is that I'm finding it increasingly difficult to understand the logic of continuing this war, or of why Ukraine doesn't do what I think makes far more sense for it to do, which is to come to terms. And also, by the way, why the Western powers are not encouraging it to do so. There was apparently, I haven't read it or seen it, a rather bitter speech, further speech by Zelensky. I'm taking this from third-party sources, but even if this isn't quite what Zelensky said, it seems that it's true. It is in any event essentially true. Zelensky apparently complained that whilst in public, NATO, the Western powers, continued to pretend that the option of Ukraine joining NATO one day was a real one, in private they were telling the Ukrainians that it would never happen. Well, all I can say is that that was deeply duplicitous and deceitful, and in a sense ultimately unethical. You cannot, in a situation like this, over an issue which both Ukraine and Russia, Ukraine's NATO membership, see as existential, tell the Ukrainians in public one thing, that they will one day join NATO, and tell the Ukrainians, and by the way also the Russians, in private something else, which is that Ukraine will never join NATO. That appears to leave the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO open, with both the Ukrainians and the Russians accordingly formulating their policies on that basis, whilst at the same time, in effect, showing that the West is not going to do anything to defend Ukraine in the event that it is attacked by Russia, as of course it has been. The correct, proper, ethical, responsible thing to have done, and the thing which might have prevented the war, was for the Western powers to say openly, straightforwardly, and honestly, and in a written document, both to the Ukrainians and to the Russians, that the decision taken at that disastrous summit in Bucharest in 2008 to invite Ukraine and Georgia into NATO had in effect been reversed, and that this invitation to those two countries had now been cancelled. Had that happened, the Ukrainians and the Russians would surely have come to terms, and the likelihood, the probability is that the war that we are now seeing would have been avoided. So it was completely irresponsible to lead Ukraine down what Professor Mearsheimer has called the primrose path of pretending that Ukraine would one day join NATO, leading it into this disastrous war, disastrous in every respect, when that was never really seriously intended. But that was before, and now it seems to me that we are in a similar situation. Because what the Financial Times article shows, and shows in great detail, is that Western governments are actually very well informed about the true military picture in Ukraine. They know that Ukraine is actually losing the war. They know that the Ukrainian army is being destroyed. They know that lots of Ukrainians are dying. They know also, of course, that some Russians are dying too. And they know that all this is happening, even though the outcome is one that they are fully conscious of, that the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine is going to be destroyed, that thousands of Ukrainians will be taken prisoner or killed or wounded. And they must also know that the situation overall in Ukraine is of a looming defeat. So, given that this is so, why do they not encourage the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia? Why do they not give the Ukrainians the advice that the Ukrainians need to hear, that the West cannot support Ukraine, that it will not support Ukraine, that Ukraine, by holding out, is simply risking an even more total and comprehensive defeat, and that its best policy, therefore, is to come to terms? I say that because I still can't quite bring myself to believe that there's ever going to be any meaningful Western military intervention in Ukraine, such as would rescue Ukraine from its predicament. Why persist, therefore, in fictions like the West's invitation to Ukraine to join NATO, which still remains in place, by the way? The Budapest summit decision from 2008 has not been reversed, despite its utter unreality. Why go through the motions of pretending to give Ukraine financial and economic and even military support, even though, to be straightforward about it, all of that is increasingly looking as if it has no real relevance or bearing to the situation? Why not tell the Ukrainians, you're on your own, the situation is now disastrous for you, there's nothing more we can do realistically that's going to help you. So the best thing you can do is to come to terms. You've already accepted that you're not going to join NATO. You've already apparently made some commitments about scaling down the size of your armed forces to meet Russian concerns. You've also accepted that there have to be some changes to your policy of Ukrainization within Ukraine itself to allow for greater use of the Russian language. Why not accept also the actual realities, which is that Donbass and Crimea are forever lost? I'm not saying necessarily that you need to accept formally in a treaty that, but perhaps you can offer the Russians some kind of face-saving compromise, perhaps a referendum in these regions, perhaps something else which would accept the de facto loss of these countries. Why not tell Ukrainians what the true situation is, rather than let the situation continue in this fashion until causing more people to die? Now, I'm well aware that people will criticize these sentiments. They'll say that they're capitulationist, but I've never really understood the logic of hopeless stands, be it in Mariupol or be it in a general war. Indeed, I remember from my very extensive historical readings that there have been many people, many critics who've complained about the attitude of the German government, of the German leadership during the Second World War, that they insisted on keeping